even something, even if they don't go with the surgery, but the very first thing when these kids go in and they've been indoctrinated into this stuff, I mean, from the very beginning, a doctor can prescribe puberty blockers, and they always tell them, this is just going to pause puberty, and then if you want to go through your regular puberty later, you just stop taking the blockers, everything, then your puberty, and you just go back to normal. Mm-hmm. Absolutely untrue, because puberty is a natural process. You can't just hit pause on it with some drugs and expect everything to be okay.
This week on Connecting the Gap, we welcome back Luke Taylor to the podcast. We're going to be talking about youth, transgenderism, and the gay agenda, and we'll be back right after this. In this world, there are many disconnects that cause chaos in our lives. Connecting the Gap podcast is birthed from the desire to share hope and restoration of the power of the gospel by being transparent and open in our biblical walk with God. Let's take a few moments this week as we navigate God's Word and encourage each other to connect the gap. Welcome once again to Connecting the Gap podcast. I'm Daniel Moore, your host for this podcast. We've got an excellent show lined up this week. Thank you guys for joining us. Before we go any further, you can go visit our website at connectingthegap.net. There you'll find all of our platforms that we're released on each and every week. And you can also contact us there through the website as well. Or you can also contact us by email at daniel@connectingthegap.net. So if you have anything you'd ever want to add to our discussions that we do each week, whether if it's positive or negative, I'm willing to take either of that from you. Just please go ahead and get a hold of us. We'd just love to hear from you, the listener, and let you have some input on the show, or just give us some encouragement or some prayers, send some prayers our way, whatever it may be. We would love to hear from you. So we'll go ahead and got all that out of the way. We're going to go ahead and get into our episode for this week. And of course, last week, if you've listened to last week's by now, you know I had a special guest here, Luke Taylor. And as I stated on that podcast, Luke is back with me this week, and he is going to be handling a whole new subject matter this week on our podcast. Luke is the host for the Cross References podcast, and I'm also going to give a shout out to his fake news podcast. He has another podcast called Fake News, a fiery but mostly peaceful podcast that he also hosts. So some of you guys know that I do a monthly woke news brief on my podcast. Well, Luke puts out a podcast just on fake news, debunking all of the fake stuff that's going on out there. It's an excellent podcast to check out. So go ahead and check both of those out. And Luke, thanks again for joining me this week.
Oh, hey, thanks for your kind words, and I had a great time last time, so I'm really thankful to be back.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I know we've been kind of discussing this one for a little bit here to get prepped and ready for it. And as we do start this week, I do want to put a disclaimer on this one right up front. There's going to be some very sensitive material that will be discussed this week. So if you have young listeners around that you don't necessarily want them to hear everything that is said on this podcast this week, you might want to take that into consideration and listen to this a different time when you're not around them. So we just wanted to get that out of the way here at the very beginning. This week, after last week, we talked about the state of our youth and, basically their spirituality, where they're at in their Bible reading and their church attendance and all that kind of stuff. And of course, before we do get started here, just in case you have picked up on this podcast without hearing last week's, Luke, won't you go ahead and just give us just a slight background on yourself again, and an introduction to let us know what you've done in the past to be able to talk to us about all of this today.
Oh, well, I was a youth pastor for the past 9 years. They were 9 wonderful years, and so I'm really thankful for that time. I got to sow into a lot of different kids' lives, and so we talked about that a lot last time, and how a lot of the modern generation is growing up in a very unchurched atmosphere, which is kind of new in America. We've always had a very strong Christian heritage and background, biblical worldview, even among people who weren't necessarily Christians, but we had a society that respected church and pastors and the Bible and all that, and that it's not the case anymore. And so, we talked about that a lot last time, and also this issue we'll be talking about today, a lot of this LGBT, transgender things going on in the culture. These are issues that I really threw myself into researching a lot when I was a youth pastor, because I knew this is what so many kids were being indoctrinated into.
Yes, and before going any further here, I mentioned your podcast, and here over this last month, you've been giving some double doses of your episodes over this last month, and you actually have went through a small series on transgenderism, and I highly, highly recommend any of my listeners to go check that out. Luke, you actually started with the history of kind of where transgenderism began and kind of took it through several episodes there. So it's very highly informational, and I think that it's a good supplement to what we're going to go through this week as we go through the episode that we have for this week. And so I definitely would advise anyone to go check those out. But we know that our youth are being bombarded from all sides these days, and we also know, especially from the last couple of weeks here, as we are thankfully coming to the close of Pride Month. I'm so glad that Pride Month's about over with. But as the month has went along, Satan has really just dug in deeper and deeper as the weeks have passed by. And last week was, very disgusting with a lot of things that took place. And a lot of things came out last weekend where they were very clear that they're coming after our youth. They're coming after our kids, and they're not going to let anybody stop them. I mean, they've got this agenda, and they're going after that agenda, and they're battling all the way.
Yeah, no, it kind of got off to a slow start. I thought as far as Pride Month, you didn't see as much of it being blatant this year at the start. But yeah, it really ramped up this past weekend. Yeah,
it did, and it got very disgusting for any of you that might have seen some of that, on Twitter and that kind of thing. But as we get started this week into this, there's a lot of stats, of course, that kind of come into play here with this transgenderism and the gay agenda when it comes to our youth and to our children. And we want to hit on some of that this week and maybe kind of enlighten all of you out there about a little bit about what's going on. There's a very evil world out there that is trying to change the reality of our future, of our country, the reality of the future of our future leaders and our children. And it's plenty of time now that we need to stand up and understand what's going on. And us as a church, or us as a conservative group of people, not even necessarily if you're not even church going, but you're a conservative minded person, it's time that we all need to stand up against this. If we don't, Satan's going to run with this, and he's going to end up winning that battle. As we look back, there was a 2020 census that took place, and in that study, it found that 15% of the estimated 1.1 million same-sex couples in the U.S. had at least one child under 18 in their household. And we know that the transgenderism has kind of evolved from the gay. This all kind of started out with the lesbian, the gay, the bisexual, the queer. It kind of started with all of that, and it has evolved now into this transgender thing. And so it kind of brings up to mind where kind of Fry the Frog, what I like to say, fry the frog. You put the frog in the frying pan, and you start it out cool, and then you slowly heat up that pan, and that frog will sit there, and he'll enjoy the warmth and warmth and warmth until he's fried. He doesn't have the sense to get out of it. And I think that's kind of what's happened here to an extent with the gay agenda and what's happening with the transgenderism now. It kind of started out with just, the gay lifestyle and that kind of thing. Then they were allowed to be parents, to have children in their households, to adopt. All of this has just been taking place, and it's just escalated now to where it's literally just a disgusting situation that we have now of pedophiles that are going after our kids. And I didn't realize that many households, had children in them that were same-sex and that kind of thing. So I found that very interesting. New estimates based on CDC health surveys point to a stark generational shift in the growth of the transgender population here in the U.S. The number of young people who identify as transgender has nearly doubled in recent years, according to a new report that New York Times revealed, and it captures a stark generational shift in emerging societal embrace of a diversity of gender identities. The analysis, relying on governmental health surveys conducted from 2017 to 2020, estimated that 1.4% of 13 to 17-year-olds and 1.3% of 18 to 24-year-olds were transgender, compared with about 0.5% of all adults. So already in these early stats here, we're seeing that the transgenderism is actually hitting our youth in much bigger numbers
Absolutely.
than it is in the adult. And I think that probably has to do with the generational shifts, I would assume. These figures illustrated a significant rise since the researchers' previous report, which was in 2017. Experts said that young people increasingly have the language and social acceptance to explore their gender identities, whereas older adults may feel more constrained. But the numbers, which vary widely from state to state, also raise questions about the role of peer influence or the political climate of the community. The notion of what it means to live as a transgender person is also shifting. There's a Dr. Gepford, who is non-binary, noted that many teenagers would not necessarily want or need hormones or surgeries to transition to another gender, as was typical of older generations. And with that statement, I think what we're seeing here, if you agree with me on this, I think we're seeing a shift where in the previous generation, they actually felt like they had to take the medications and go through the transformational surgeries to become transgender, where in today's society, they can think that they're transgender. They don't necessarily have to go through those surgeries to state that they are.
Oh, right.
That they are a different sex.
Yeah.
So in this situation, how does absolute truth play in that part? One thing that I want you to do here first is I would like for you to explain what transgender is. And for these people out there, because for the longest time, over the past years, as this transgender thing started becoming more and more of an issue, they always said, that guys can get pregnant and all this other stuff that went on. And for a while, that just blew my mind. I'm like, how in the world can somebody say that when you know they can't, But as times went along, I've come to realize that this is a mind thing. It's a non-truth, basically, that they're believing. So explain kind of what transgender is and what does it mean when somebody says that a man can get pregnant in today's society?
Well, so everything you were saying right there, that, it's exploding more and more that these young people are believing these things. Well, that's because, if someone is 40 years old, 50 years old, 70 years old, they've been around for a while. You can't just walk in and tell them, oh, well, this person you've always known as a man is now a woman. We know that that's not true. We know that they've always been a man. But you take a young child or a teenager, they're so much more impressionable. They don't have this whole history. And so it's much easier to confuse young people. It's much easier to change definitions on them and for them to just accept it because they don't have a long history. Their brains are still forming. And so they're very, very easy or very open to deceive. And so that's why we see a lot of these kids being targeted. And so what some very, I would say, sadistic psychologists, people like Alfred Kinsey and John Money, who I've been doing some research of, they're the ones who introduced these ideas, these modern ideas of sexual orientation and transgender identity. What John Money, and this was a man who was very pro-pedophilia, did insane studies, you might call it research, on children, gender confused them, and he came up with this theory that gender is something that can be separated from sex. And so he taught that gender is something that just exists in the mind, kind of like you were saying, but that our sex refers to our physical characteristics. And so for most people out there, the words sex and gender have always just basically meant the same thing, that there was no difference. And that is true. There's really no difference. But John Money introduced this idea that your gender identity could be something different from your biological sex. And so from there, people have ran with this idea that, oh, my gender, I might be a biological female, but my gender identity, I identify as a male. And it's been just decided, it's just been pushed on us by these psychologists that your gender is who you truly are. It is this thing just in someone's mind, what they feel that they are, and that should take precedence over biological reality. And I think that word reality is very important because transgenderism is a detachment from reality. It just means that reality is just whatever you want to make it become in your mind. And so this isn't just a war on gender, but I see it as a war on reality itself.
We talked a little bit about last week of the transgender population by states, the two coasts or whatever. And it's showing here that data shows that the distribution of trans people by state, New York has the largest estimated population of transgender teenagers at 3%, whereas Wyoming has the lowest at 0.6%. Transgender adults showed a narrower range, with 0.9% of adults identifying as transgender in like North Carolina and 0.2% in Missouri. So with those kind of stats in mind, what are we seeing with that? Why do we have such a bigger percentage on the coast versus in the mid states?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, those are much more liberal or progressive cultures out there, and so as much as they want to tell us that transgenderism is something that just occurs naturally, no, this is very much a social construct. There's very much a social pressure on people to identify this way. And so especially if you live in a place like New York or over on the West Coast, like somewhere in California or Seattle, there's much more of a societal acceptance and a push for people to not adhere to strict or traditional guidelines when it comes to things like sex and gender.
Yeah. And me and you had kind of talked about this a little bit at one point also. A lot of times with us living where we do here in central U.S., a lot of times we feel like that we're kind of untouchable by some of the stuff that takes place. But you and I have both discussed, good examples, COVID. Whenever COVID started happening overseas, I know the first thoughts that was in my mind is, man, I hope it stays over there. I hope it doesn't ever make it to the United States. Well, next thing we knew, the cases started popping up in California.
Right.
Then you've got them coming into New York and, these different places. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm glad I'm in the middle of the United States, because I'm away from all of that. But before we knew it, COVID was everywhere. Little bitty towns around me, just all over the place. COVID, it touched everyone. And I think that with this transgender and this gay agenda, I think that that's where we're headed here in the future if we don't stand up and be vocal about what's going on and try to put a stop to that.
Right.
It's just going to continue to fluctuate and grow, and it's going to touch everybody's life eventually.
Well, if I could add something to that, I mean, so much of what I think we want people to realize is just how pervasive this is already. We might see higher statistics on the coasts, but what I also see is, regardless of where somebody lives, those youngest generations are the ones who are the most heavily susceptible to this. So even here in the middle of America, when I was a youth pastor and I'd interact with young people, I mean, they're almost totally accepting of these transgender lifestyles and homosexual lifestyles and just everything in the LGBT, X, Y, and Z, all the whole acronym that they've got going now. They're very on board with that. If I could share a study that I saw, Barna did this research, and this came out a year ago, where they said 30% of millennials identify as LGBTQ. And this was a study they put out. Let me see here. Among millennials, 30% identify as LGBTQ. That's more than 3 times the rest of the adult population. And then when they broke that down even further to the youngest of the group, which they call Gen Z, that's ages 18 to 24, they found that the number goes up to 39% identifies LGBTQ.
Wow. 18
to 24-year-olds, 39% are identifying as somewhere on that spectrum. And that's 40%. That's coming up on half of the population when you look at that youngest segment.
Yeah.
And so it's something that's exploding the younger and younger you go.
And I think it kind of hinges off what we talked about last week. If our kids aren't in church, if they're not, having a good biblical foundation poured into them every week by encouraging them to stay in the Word, encouraging them to have a prayer life, encouraging them to be around good friends. There's just so many things that encompasses that. The kids and the youth are so gullible, and they want to fit in. They want to make everybody like them, and all of these things that takes place as they're growing up, and they're trying to figure out who they are and trying to figure out their identity. And I think a lot of that kind of goes back to that to an extent of how our kids are being raised today.
Well, and I would have teenagers tell me, if you identify as one of those letters in the LGBT acronym, instant celebrity status at your school.
Yeah.
This is a popularity thing too, and I'm not saying that's what always drives it, but that is a powerful incentive for a lot of kids.
Yeah, and transgender as a term sounds harmless, and it's made so cool through the media. TikTok Snapchat, social media outlets everywhere has all kinds of indoctrinating material for them to access. And TikTok is probably one of the worst from what I've seen as far as reading reports. I've never had TikTok on my phone, and I never will. But I have seen news reports where they've done screenshots of videos and things where transgender youth have gotten on TikTok and showed their scars and just made it look like this awesome thing. You know, I'm becoming who I want to be and who I am, and I'm proud of it. And a lot of kids are being influenced by all of that. And what ends up happening at that point is, you know, kids have become a test subject for this whole agenda, for the whole transgender agenda. The child has a moment of confusion in their life, and an adult brings up, well, you know, maybe you're a boy, maybe you're a girl, you know, and then they're sent through the pipeline of transgender affirmation with hormones, treatments, which you can get very easily these days. And eventually, if it goes far enough, they end up in a surgery room at an OR. And then their lives are changed forever at that point. You know, once kids' brains have been trained to that kind of thinking, you may never get them to come back from that. And the reasons for the mental issues with how kids think about their gender is really never explored, in my opinion, today. Instead, they're always pushed to believe that they're something they're not until they believe it in their own minds and decide to change the rest of their lives. From what I'm seeing with the transgenderism, it's a mind thing. They've got something going on up there that needs to be treated. But for the big part of it, the medical community is totally ignoring that. Would you agree with me on that? You know?
Oh, absolutely. It's a mental illness because it is a detachment from reality. And mental illnesses, people can be born with those things, but what we're seeing is they can be induced by the culture, by confusing people, it's a form of abusing people. You know, it's tricking them. And for people who don't have that Christian foundation, then, you know, you open yourself up to all kinds of dangers and deceptions from the enemy. Yeah. And so this is the deception that Satan is really using here in what I believe are these last days, but I think this is a big push he's making. I saw this article. This was a few years ago in Psychology Today. Okay. This is what psychologists were saying just a few years ago. We talk about how quickly society has changed, but they were talking about, this is an article called How Sexual Abusers Try to Groom Children. And it says stage 4, desensitization to sexual content and physical contact. And it says perpetrators prepare the minor for abuse by desensitizing them to sexual content, such as showing them pornography and nudity. And when you think about that, it's just like, as you were saying a few minutes ago, the kind of stuff they're putting on TikTok and putting in front of kids, the kind of stuff we saw happening last weekend in Seattle and New York with these pride marches where people are wandering around, marching around completely nude, and there's children there present. You know, a few years ago that we recognized this as grooming. Today they get mad if you call them groomers and stuff like that. But I mean, that's exactly what they're doing. We're just calling it out. Yeah. And I actually had an article here. It was in the Washington Stand. It came out today, actually. The title of it was "Don't say gay, say groomer instead." And in this article, for those that aren't familiar exactly with that term, grooming is the act of deceptively building a relationship of trust with a child, most often utilizing a position of authority in order to take advantage of a child sexually. The LGBT ideology is predicated upon grooming, but we obviously don't take our word for it, you take their word for it. We all know that a man can't impregnate another man, nor can a woman impregnate another woman. In other words, LGBT activists cannot reproduce, so instead they recruit. They groom. Children are taught that being gay or lesbian or bi or trans is not only acceptable, but even cool. And being but children, they believe that. And in essence, that's grooming. That's what ends up happening. So whether if these people like to be called groomers or not, that's what they are. We're just calling it what it is.
I mean, you just got to put it out there on the table. There's no other definition for that. And then you have the schools, which are just as much of an issue. There are private LGBTQ groups in schools that are considered safe places, and they won't tell your parents. Mm-hmm. They distribute flyers around the school in different places for members to find out about the next secret meetings, and they are told their parents won't be told anything. They gather vulnerable children and basically tell them that it's us against them. It's the children against the parents, mm-hmm. because no one will ever understand them outside that circle. It places a wedge between the child and the parent. Parents and people around them are then considered unsafe spaces because they call their children by their names and don't affirm them. And this week, California Democrats have advanced legislation. This happened Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And this is actually, it would be the 26th, I guess, of June, Tuesday, that would give therapists unconditional power to remove 12-year-olds from their parents if their parents don't affirm them as transgender or whatever their children want to be. And so if this passes in California, the parents are going to be basically losing complete control of their kids. And of course, a lot of the parents there are furious about this, obviously. Mm-hmm. For one thing, it's going to give children excuses to run away from home, to go into custody of the state or of other places and that yep. kind of thing. And this is definitely, not a good thing. And, with the safe spaces type of thing or whatever, what would you say to parents that find out something like that's going on with their child? What's some advice that you could give them as far as how to handle a situation like that?
What if they're living in California?
Well, anywhere.
I mean, I guess first I'd tell someone, it's actually what a Republican legislator in California, he said, I'm moving out whenever I get done with my term. He's one of the state senators out there. And he says I'm getting out of here, and I suggest other parents do too. He says this is bad news for parents in California, but they will try to push this on a federal level too, mm-hmm. and get this going everywhere. And so we have to stand against it. You have to protect your kids. You have to. There's good teachers in public schools. Of course I don't say all public schools are bad. But, parents need to be thinking about who is educating your child. You need to know who's educating your child, what their agenda is, what kind of stuff's in the school library. And this is what's causing a lot of parents to strongly consider homeschool or Christian schools, private schools, stuff like that, because the state is definitely pushing this agenda on children. Yeah.
And don't think that it's not happening. There's actually a movie it's a documentary actually that just came out. It's called Gender Transformation, The Untold Realities is the name of it. It's put out by Epic News. And you can go to the website, gendertransformation.com. They follow a story on there of a parent that this actually happened to her. Her daughter decided that she wanted to be a boy. And basically what ended up happening there towards the end, it went to court. The court was trying to force her to sign off to allow her daughter to start the hormone treatments and the things that takes place with all of that. She refused. And so the judge looked at her and said, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to sign off on it for her. She needs this treatment. And the judge signed off on it, which then allowed her daughter to start taking those hormone treatments. They took her daughter out of the home and they put her into a safe house, quote unquote safe house. And they continued to indoctrinate her and put her through these therapies. They gave the mom 1 hour a week to visit her daughter. And she had strict rules. She couldn't say anything about her coming back home. She couldn't talk about the therapy she was going through. She couldn't talk about the transformation that she was wanting to do. And they told her she had to be completely tight-lipped on any of that. If she spoke up any time about any of those different subjects, wow, that her time would be completely taken away from her completely. Mm-hmm. And she would not be able to visit her daughter at all. And what ended up happening in the end of that, just a spoiler alert, but the daughter ended up stepping in front of a train mm-hmm. back in 2019 and took her own life. Mm-hmm. And this is real. This is a real epidemic that we have going on in our country, the United States. Other countries are looking at us that think we're crazy because of what is going on in our states right now. But this is definitely something that we have got to keep on our radar. So we're going to take a short break here for a second, and we'll be back here in a moment. We're going to continue this. I've got Luke Taylor with me this week. He's the host of the podcast Cross References, and he's sitting in with me this week. We're talking about youth, transgenderism, and the gay agenda. We'll be back right after this.
Today on Principles for Living, author and Christian businessman Bill Zekman shares advice on everyday living.
Have you ever experienced whiteout conditions in a blizzard? Many people have died when trying to walk somewhere in blizzard conditions. This happens when people can't see where they're going. Without fixed reference points, we tend to walk in circles and eventually end up going nowhere. It's the same when we don't have a base to set our morals by. We need a moral standard. We can't know right from wrong unless we are taught it. By nature, we gravitate towards perversion. What is the reference point you use to set your standard by? For me, it's the Bible. The Bible sets clear reference points. If you let it, it will set you on the right track. And the unmovable reference point to keep your eyes on is Jesus.
Receive Bill Zekman's free booklet, Stop Glorifying Man, when you call 888-881-3411. That's 888-881-3411.
Welcome back to this week's episode of Connecting the Gap. I'm Daniel Moore, your host for this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us this week. If you've been listening in on the first half of this, we've got a pretty deep subject this week as we're talking about our youth, transgenderism, and the gay agenda. And if you do have young ears, I'm sure you've figured this out by now, but some of the stuff we're talking about this week could be a little bit sensitive in that area. So we definitely want to give you that disclaimer to know that you might want to listen to this at a different time if you've caught this halfway through or whatever the situation is. So just wanted to put that out there. We've talked a lot about some different things here in the first half of this week's episode. As we start off this second half, transgenderism, I do see, as it's coming out in the news more and more, we are starting to see a lot of kids that have tried to trans over, detransing.
Right.
And we're starting to see that take place. And I actually came across a story here recently. There's an adult female in California that is now suing doctors and hospitals for cutting off her breast when she was 13 years old. She originally thought she was male and was finally passed off to doctors that affirmed her belief with puberty blockers and hormones and a double mastectomy within 6 months of her care. She has now detransitioned with lots of psychological therapy to go. As we see this happening, what do you think is starting to take place now in society? Because we're hearing more and more stories like this, where they go through this whole change. There's another story of a guy that was in the movie that I mentioned earlier, the documentary. He transitioned to a girl, and he's had 3 chest surgeries because he had one to put in breast, and he had one to take them back out, and then he had a bunch of extra skin from the first surgery. He had to have that one done. Now he has no feeling in his chest whatsoever. Yeah. The hormones have majorly affected his genitalia. He says it's extremely hard to go to the restroom. Of course, his sexual functions are no longer there. Do you think that these stories coming out like this are helping that cause a little bit, or do you think people are just starting to wake up and see what's going on? Or what do you think is going on there?
I mean, it is definitely helping the anti-transgender argument whenever you hear these stories come out. But, you know, the media also pushes a lot of these stories down. They don't want people to hear about it. The pharmaceutical industries and the medical industry, they've got what they wanted from these people. They charge, a huge amount for the surgeries. And then now that person's going to have to be hooked on different types of medicines and drugs for the rest of their life, just because of all the changes that have been done to their bodies. And so, I mean, they got what they wanted out of them. A lot of this is a way for people in the medical industry to profit. And these gender clinics, I mean, are making big bucks off of this stuff. So, I hopefully this girl in California can win her lawsuit. But there's also been a lot of laws put into place that say, once you sign off on having these changes made to your body, there's no going back, and they already put these clauses in the contracts that say you can't come back and sue them. So, I mean, I hope she's successful, and I hope they can fight back against this through any legal means possible. But once the damage is done, I mean, these changes are permanent, and there really is no going back. So I hope more people will speak out.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that they don't think about in the long run is when you work on your body like that, surgery-wise, and start cutting things off, and you can pretty much put, bearing children out the door. I mean, that's not going to happen.
Right.
If you start taking your female and male organs away and trying to replace those with the opposite. So even if you try to transition later, that's something that's gone forever.
Yep.
You know, that's never going to happen. There was another story that I came across where a girl named Jasmine, she had her breast removed at 15 and she now regrets it. She discussed about her detransitioning after a transgender surgery, and her quote was, "I feel a little bit mutilated, like an experiment gone wrong." That was the exact statement that came out of her mouth now that she has realized what she's done to herself. And the bad thing about that, she's got to live with that the rest of her life. You know, that'll never change.
Well, even something, even if they don't go with the surgery, but the very first thing when these kids go in and they've been indoctrinated into this stuff, I mean, from the very beginning, a doctor can prescribe puberty blockers, and they always tell them, this is just going to pause puberty, and then if you want to go through your regular puberty later, you just stop taking the blockers, everything, then your puberty, and you just go back to normal. Absolutely untrue, because puberty is a natural process. You can't just hit pause on it with some drugs and expect everything to be okay.
Yeah.
And so these kids that start taking these injections of these unnatural chemicals being put into their body, it has permanent effects. They're sterilized a lot of the time. It often leads to certain types of cancer. And so even just something as simple as the puberty blockers, which is just kind of like the baseline thing that they start into, even that's going to have permanent effects.
Yeah. And you was talking earlier about the medical, you know, part of the documentary the Epic News put out, they were actually listening in on some meetings that some medical personnel had. They got some footage from it, and they were talking about how $40,000 to do a top surgery, and how many thousands of dollars they would gain to do the bottom half. And then they started adding up, if we do this many this month, this brings in this many thousands of dollars. That's all they were talking about. They weren't even talking about the person that was going to be mutilated and have to live with that for the rest of their life. So, you know, what you were stating earlier about the money side of things, unfortunately, from the medical community, I feel like you do. I feel like it's a money thing. It's greed that's driving this whole movement. There's an article that I came across here from the Washington Stand the other day. It says, although left-wing activists often say they represent the quote-unquote right side of history, a well-regarded poll finds that support for a key item of the LGBTQ agenda has collapsed faster than virtually any other issue. Significant fewer Americans support allowing men to use women's restrooms in 2022 than in 2016. We know that originally Target was one of the first ones that pushed to let men and women share restrooms without an issue because they claimed that they were the other sex. We do find that a surprisingly large number of Democrats backing restroom privacy laws has grown by 4 points in 2022 to 31% over the level in 2016, which was 27%. So even the Democrats are starting to back off now from this agenda that they were pushing. So what problem do you see that is caused by letting our genders mix in restrooms in places that should be more private for each gender? What issues do you see coming out of that when we allow that to happen?
Well, I mean, for one thing, there's the safety issue. You know, the abuse can take place whenever you start mixing the genders in the restrooms and, you know, letting grown men go into restrooms with young girls. I mean, there's been already story after story. People don't see this all the time, but there's already been story after story of predators using that to their advantage. But so there's the safety issue. There's the comfort issue. I mean, you know, most, you know, guys don't want a female walking into the restroom where they are, and vice versa. So there's a comfort issue. And then on a sociological level, it creates the gender confusion. That's what we really have going on, is that ever since, really, you go back to the gay marriage debate of 10 years ago, and when it was legalized in 2015 across the board, across the whole country, that just injected confusion into the population. That's why the transgender thing has exploded since then, because it wasn't just it wasn't just about the gay marriage. All of a sudden, when men can be with men and women can be with women and a family can be whatever, it's gone back. It's just down to this very basic level. There's a confusion about gender that has exploded in society since then, which I see as a spiritual thing. I mean, this has opened the doors for all kinds of demonic activity and deceptive influences of Satan in society ever since gay marriage was official. Yeah, there's a very the things that we took as basic. In the beginning, God made male and female. Well, you ask a modern person today in America, they think there's more than two genders. So all this has just caused a confusion across the board.
Yeah, and I've got a few stories here actually that you was talking about some things in the news. Of course, remember Loudoun County Public Schools, I believe I said that right. Mm-hmm. They've been indicted in Virginia on charges related to an attempts to cover up 2 sexual assaults in a girl's bathroom and in an empty classroom perpetrated against a female student by a male student who identified as gender fluid. In March of earlier this year, an 18-year-old male exposed his genitals to a child inside a gender-neutral restroom in Wisconsin's Rhinelander High School. A 5-year-old girl said a male student who identified as gender fluid sexually molested her inside the restroom of Oakhurst Elementary School in Decatur, Georgia on November 16th of 2017. The school district violated Title IX by failing to adequately investigate the incident. According to a 2020 ruling from the Office of Civil Rights in the Trump administration's Education Department. And then police arrested a man for indecent exposure inside a woman's restroom in Charlotte, North Carolina in July 2016. And these stories just go on and on of all this stuff that's taking place. And it's obvious, we know that men, we talked about this last week when we was talking about pornography, the way that the man is made up in his human nature, we have a tendency of being visual. We're a very sexual being in person. And when you start putting people that already have a mind illness going on into a, where they shouldn't be with the opposite sex and that kind of thing, you're only setting yourself up for a lot of trouble.
Absolutely.
When that takes place. And you would think that the powers that be would see that and understand that. We also, have places like, I pulled up here, Camp Lilac. This is it's like a summer camp, basically. It's in Ohio. And this is a camp just for transgender and queer children to go to. And if you look on their page of activities that they have going on, most of it looks just like your average everyday camp that you go to, but there are, a couple of the differences. One of them is they separate their students by age instead of gender. So you're going to have boys and girls together in the same spaces based on how they identify. And then part of their activities throughout the day are trans-centered activities, celebration of trans identities and everything they do at the camp. And they host makeup and hair tutorials, voice training, and more. I mean, if you've got a camp trying to teach your young son how to talk like a girl, I'm assuming that's what that means, in voice training. I mean, what else could that mean? It makes no sense to me of why these places do this, but this is what's going on with our kids.
Well, it's like there's church camp for Christian kids, and Satan always has to create his counterfeit. And so these are just indoctrination centers, and any parent who would send their kids to a camp like that, I mean, if they're that far gone, the kids are probably already getting indoctrinated at home. But yeah, it sounds like a dangerous place to be sending kids. Yeah,
it's definitely not a good place at all. And I came across a article, this is about a couple weeks ago, that I came across this one, and the title of it was, "How did we get to the ridiculous point where only trans women can be called women?" And it caught my eye when I saw that. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it here. It says, what exactly we need to ask ourselves is a lesbian? Most people, I suspect, would regard this question as reasonably straightforward and reply, a woman that's attracted to women. But that definition, it seems, is now out of date. The correct answer is as follows: a non-man attracted to non-men. At least that's what it says in the new LGBTQ glossary published by Johns Hopkins, a leading American university. You may be wondering whether it defines gay men in turn as non-women. Funnily, it doesn't. A gay man is simply a man attracted to other men. In summary, a man is a man, a woman is a non-man. So when you read stuff like that, it's just like, good grief.
Right.
I mean, where are we at as a society? And it just plays more into this thing where we're just erasing women off the map.
It's kind of like Matt Walsh had that great documentary that we watched. We watched this before, but what is a woman?
Yep. Very, very good documentary, by the way, for anybody out there that would, wants to watch something to kind of get yourself up to date on exactly where society's at. That one definitely is an excellent documentary to go watch. Another article that I came across here, that LGBT identifying people admit that churches provide best community life. And I found this interesting as I was kind of reading through this just a little bit. It says that as Western society becomes increasingly secularized and attends religious services in ever-dwindling numbers, a curious phenomenon is simultaneously occurring. People who identify as religiously unaffiliated or nuns, or as LGBT, still express longing for the community life that only religious institutions provide. And I found that interesting because they make fun of religion, they make fun of people that try to live biblically and have a biblical community around them.
Right.
But yet, after they start going through this whole process of changing their life to the lifestyle that they believe that they are, it's crazy. It just comes right back to being, godly things. It comes back to that community.
G.K. Chesterton had this great quote. He said, "When men choose not to believe in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything." And I think about that a lot as you kind of look at some of this transgender stuff and all the LGBT things. It pushes people away from God because they're rejecting God's natural order, the way that He created the world to be. They're going against that. It is a form of rebellion against God. They might mock the idea of God, but then they will go off into believing all kinds of other stuff too. I don't know if you saw this. I just saw it just from the past few days. This has kind of came out that last Sunday in a lot of churches, and these would not be really what I'd even consider churches. They're some of these progressive churches that try to teach a more liberal form of Christianity that accepts all of these things. And they had something that they put out called the Sparkle Creed. Have you heard about that?
Yes, I just saw that today.
Yeah, this was supposed to be kind of a their counterfeit of the Apostles' Creed about what they believe in, but they call it the Sparkle Creed. And I won't read the whole thing, but it begins, "I believe in the non-binary God whose pronouns are plural." When I saw that, I thought, you know what? I'm just glad they're admitting that they believe in a different God.
Yep.
Because that's not the God I believe in.
Yep. And I think part of that too was that God had Jesus had two fathers. It went on with quite a bit of stuff, and that I actually watched that whole church service to see exactly. There's another prayer in that exact service that's even crazier than that one, and they have this church is, if I remember right, I believe is in Minnesota or Wyoming. It's one of them two states. It's a Lutheran church, Edina Community Lutheran Church. And they have, if you go through their staff page, they have active LGBTQ people on their staff. And that particular Sparkle Creed there was about 2 or 3 weeks ago is when they read that, and it was their Pride Sunday celebration. They had a Pride picture booth set up, and 2 or 3 times throughout that church service, they reminded people and their kids to make sure they took advantage of the Pride booth to take their pictures and have fun with the Pride booth and all that stuff. And it's so disgusting. To me, I don't know if I could sit through a church service like that without worrying about lightning striking, I don't see how they can do it. And what's crazy too is probably 90% of that audience was at least 65 years and older.
I noticed that when I looked at I saw a picture. It was all very elderly people.
That blows my mind because that's the generation that, in statistics, actually has a lot lower number of being transgender, bisexual, gay, all that kind of stuff. And so it really shocked me when I saw how their congregation numbers were. But I guess if you grow up in a religious affiliation like that And again, they fry the frog. They just gradually introduce stuff subtly as time goes along. I guess that shows how indoctrination works.
Yeah, I mean that was in a Lutheran church,
Yes.
right? And I don't want to offend anyone listening. There's good Lutherans out there. There's good Methodists out there. But also one thing you notice is that there's some of these denominations, the Lutherans and Methodists in particular, and Presbyterians also. A segment of them started by jettisoning the doctrine of inerrancy of the Scripture. So basically they said, well, the Bible has mistakes. We don't have to listen to the Bible. And then they started introducing all these other things. Those are some of the mainline denominations that were kind of an anchor for America for, centuries in this country. But they started to get away from God. And so I think that explains why it was some of these what we'd call traditional or classic denominations in America, where there's a lot of people there who are very into that. It's a very well-established denomination that many people have grown up in. But like you said, the frog sat in the kettle for so long, and all this stuff changed around them, and because they weren't grounded in Scripture anymore, all these things changed while they were sitting in those pews. Yeah. And so, it was interesting to me too that there were so many older people, a lot of gray hair in that audience, sitting there listening to the Sparkle Creed. Yeah.
And I'm glad you made the point. I don't want to come off that we're hate speech in here, any of that kind of thing, as we're not.
I know lots of good Lutherans and Methodists too, and they're pretty disgusted by some of the direction that their denomination has gone.
Yes, and I think one thing that we've got to remember, regardless if it's the actual child that's trying to transgender, if it is the parents that's affirming them and allowing them to transgender, if it's the medical community, whether if it's the churches or the schools, we got to understand that we're not fighting any one person. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times we forget that. We have a tendency to want to attack the person personally and try to get them to see our way and that kind of thing. The Bible explicitly tells us that we are fighting a supernatural war. And that's where we have to send our prayers to. We can live the example and try to lead and guide people that we know that are living that kind of a lifestyle to the best of our abilities without creating enemies and coming off as hateful and racist and whatever. That's not the way to do it as a Christian. But we also have to realize that our biggest battle is going to be fighting against Satan, because he has a hold on their life. And they're being told by so many people, one of the biggest lies that people are telling them is that they're stuck, that they can't get out of it, that there's no way they're going to be able to, change their life because they are who they feel like they are, and they're just stuck with that. And I think I've read where lots of people have stayed in that type of lifestyle lots of times because they really just felt like they had nowhere else to go. Mm-hmm. They were not happy with it. They did not have a joy in their life. They probably were suicidal quite often. Mm-hmm. And another stat that we definitely need to throw in here, the statement's always made, would you like to have your son or a dead daughter, or vice versa? That's probably one of and therapists are actually conditioned to say that to parents whenever they're getting help from therapists. There's a lot of therapists out there that are trained to say that. Mm-hmm. But in all reality, the suicide rate goes up 20%, 20 times higher after they transition than the stats are before they actually take that step. Mm-hmm. I think that says a lot for the fact that that's not the answer at all. But society just keeps pushing it onto them. And our government, the more that they keep moving, I have an article here, I was talking to you about it here a little bit earlier, about the HHS. They have taken on LGBT agenda, and they've made it as going on the offense now. Basically, Biden's health department is being weaponized to promote homosexuality and the transgender agenda. The Health and Human Services, which is HHS, Secretary Xavier Becerra, launched the department's Pride Summit this previous Monday here, which would have been about 4 days ago, so about the 25th or so of June. And he quipped, "Supporting the LGBTQI plus community is a top priority for me and HHS. Equity runs at the heart of every initiative that we take on here." This is one of our highest levels in government that is starting to push this agenda. And under Biden's tenure, the HHS has turned into a veritable LGBT cheerleading squad. with Becerra and Levine. Most of you know Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary of the HHS that is also transgender. And they've marched in pride parades. They've vociferously promoted gender transition procedures, including genital mutilation surgeries for minors, flying the progress flag outside HHS headquarters, hosting pro-trans roundtable discussions. And that's just what's happened this month. I mean, this is an ongoing building platform that they're creating right now.
And Levine also recently declared that this is not just the month of Pride, we're having a summer of Pride.
Yeah. Can be very discouraging when you think about what's going on in our society right now. We're getting close here to being here towards the end of this, but I did want to bring up, you had mentioned earlier about the activities that went on last week with the parades and all that kind of stuff that happened. And we know that over in New York City, they had a pride event where the participants were yelling, "We're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children." And a lot of us knows what that means. They've been chanting this for some time. There's gay groups out there that have, put songs on YouTube and just different kinds of things as far as putting their agenda out there. And NBC, after this all happened, they basically came out and tried to smooth over the whole situation.
I saw that.
And they were trying to make it sound like, it was just a joke. They were just kidding, and they tried to be real lighthearted about the whole situation in the newscasting. And of course, they're getting roasted now over that by conservative groups. And previous chants at Pride events in New York have included other chants targeting kids, such as 10% is not enough, groom, groom, groom. And they've had some violent chants like kill, 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 we're coming to kill the mayor. I mean, there's a lot of violence in parts of the transgender movement, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Satan's just going to keep driving them forward.
Well, I see this as a very satanically fueled agenda. Not just in the sense that, all sin is, evil and wrong because it's sin. But with this in particular, the transgenderism, there's something very demonic about it in nature. And it does breed a lot of violence. And the media is certainly not on our side. As you were saying, they're trying to smooth that over and cover it up. But we saw the videos. We saw what they were saying. We see what they're doing. And, it was just a few years ago that they were denying that they were going in this direction. A year and a half ago, they were like, "Oh, no one's trying to do these surgeries on children. They're not trying to do surgeries on minors." Right as we started talking about it, they were denying that it was even a thing. And now they are in full force. They're putting it on their websites, and our government administration, the current presidential administration, they are making this a key part of their agenda that they want to push this, not just on the population, but they want to push this for children.
Yeah. It's very disgusting. So I hope that all of you as parents out there are staying aware, and grandparents. I just hope that you're really paying attention to what's going on. It's almost coming to the point where we have to kind of consider our schooling for our kids. When my kids went to school, I didn't have any trouble sending them to public. And even in our community where we live right now, I think our public schools are safe for a while. But there's a lot of places in the United States right now that's not the case. They're indoctrinating our kids left and right. Are you okay with that as parents? Are you okay with that as grandparents? You're going to have to make that choice. C.S. Lewis said, "When the whole world is running towards a cliff, he who is running in the opposite direction appears to have lost his mind." And that's how the media is looking at us right now. That's how this whole agenda is looking at us right now. The transgender and the gay movement, they think that we're crazy because we're not jumping on the bandwagon of affirming what these kids think they are. But when it comes down to the reality of the whole thing, they're having mental illness and mental situations that are going on in their life that in the past doctors would have treated. They would have diagnosed these kids with autism or whatever the problem is that's going on in their minds. But today, they jump right on that bandwagon immediately. You're probably a boy or a girl. And they just start going through that whole affirming procedure. Daily Wire here recently, they did a little test where they had a guy call a couple of these medical institutions that do surgeries, and what was it?
17 minutes.
Yeah, he was affirmed. He had surgery set up. They were getting him lined out for everything, and then they doctored the paperwork so the insurance would pay for it.
Would have to pay for it. Yep.
I mean, it's just unbelievable how easy. He did all that over the phone. Didn't even have an in-person consultation or nothing. It's a scary, scary time that we're living in. And as we close today, Luke, I do appreciate you sitting in this week and talking about this with me. I knew that you had been doing this on your podcast for a while now, and with your experience with youth and everything, I knew that I just wanted to have you here to discuss this subject, and I appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it was a lot of fun. So I know it's a dark subject, but I enjoyed talking to you about it and helping to get the word out about it.
Yeah, I think we've let out a lot of information here, and I do want to say, don't stop with what you're hearing us talk about. This stuff is happening every moment as we speak. New things are taking place, and we've got to stay aware. You guys, we've got to stay up on top of this stuff and try to at least, stay some steps ahead of it. We've got to cover this in prayer. We've got to take this to the throne of God, to the throne of grace, and have God help us navigate through all of this. I do want to read some scripture here as we close today, just to kind of put a little cap on why this is taking place to an extent. This is Romans chapter 1, I believe, verses 18 to 23, and this is the Message version because I really like the way that it put it out. It said, "But God's angry displeasure erupts as acts of human mistrust and wrongdoing and lying accumulate as people try to put a shroud over truth. But the basic reality of God is plain enough. Open your eyes and there it is. By taking a long and thoughtful look at what God has created, people have always been able to see what their eyes as such can't see, eternal power, for instance, and the mystery of his divine being. So nobody has a good excuse. What happened was this: people knew God perfectly well, but when they didn't treat him like God, refusing to worship him, they trivialized themselves into silliness and confusion so that there was neither sense nor direction left in their lives. They pretended to know it all, but were illiterate regarding life. They traded the glory of God, who holds the whole world in his hands, for cheap figurines you can buy at any roadside stand. So God said, in effect, if that's what you want, that's what you get. It wasn't long before they were living in a pig pen, smeared with filth, filthy inside and out. And all this because they traded the true God for a fake God and worshiped the God they made instead of the God who made them. The God we bless, the God who blesses us. Worse followed. Refusing to know God, they soon didn't know how to be human either. Women didn't know how to be women. Men didn't know how to be men. Sexually confused, they abused and defiled one another. Women with women, men with men. All lust, no love. And then they paid for it. Emptied of God and love, godless and loveless wretches. Since they didn't bother to acknowledge God, God quit bothering them and let them run loose. And then all hell broke loose. Rampant evil, grabbing and grasping, vicious backstabbing. They made life hell on earth, and their envy, wanton killing, bickering, and cheating. Look at them, mean-spirited, venomous, fork-tongued God-bashers, bullies, swaggers, insufferable windbags. They keep inventing new ways of wrecking lives. They ditch their parents when they get in the way. Stupid, slimy, cruel, and cold-blooded. And it's not as if they didn't know better. They know perfectly well they're spitting in God's face, and they don't care. Worse, they hand out prizes to those who do the worst things the best. And I just felt like that just put this all in a nutshell.
That's a powerful rendition of those verses.
Yes, it is. And we have to remember Pride Month. The Bible tells us that after pride, there's a fall. Pride is sin. Whenever we, the transgender and the gay and our country as a whole, or we as the human race, whenever we put pride up on a pedestal like that, we're worshiping a sin. And we have to remember that there is nothing biblical or God-loving whatsoever about taking part in Pride Month. It's something that we should completely be steering away from, because the Bible specifically tells us that pride always becomes before a fall. And we definitely, need to remember that we are fighting, as I said earlier, those supernatural forces. Satan and his demonic forces are constantly just bashing us from all around. And that's what we have to remember as we go into this battle. There's plenty of scriptures in the Bible that talks about God creating man in his own image, that he created them male and female. Psalm 139:14, I praise you for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Genesis has several instances of how he created male and female and named them man and woman. In Mark 10, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Psalm 138, for you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. God knew who we were before we were even born. He had an agenda for us. We were created in his image. And as we leave today from this discussion, if maybe you're someone out there that's struggling with this battle in your own mind, where do I belong? Am I male? Am I female? You got people around you that are trying to affirm you as somebody that you're not. Dig into the Word. Start reading some of these scriptures about who God says we are. God says we're beloved. He says that we are kings and queens. He says that we're going to be reigning with him someday. He holds us to that highest standard, and he loves us like no other, and he's the only answer for those battles that we go through on a daily basis. I do want to, again, emphasize that you can visit my website if you have any question or need anything further, with this subject. You can feel free to reach out to us here at Connecting the Gap. I'll give you my email. It's daniel@connectingthegap.net, or there's a contact page there as well. Luke, can someone contact you also if they have issues with this type of thing? And if you would give your contact information.
Well, I got it. So for my podcast, I got an email called crossreferencespodcast@gmail.com. Nothing weird about the spelling. It's just what it is. crossreferencespodcast@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to interact with anybody on this subject if they got a question or if they want to look back at some of the work I've done. I really appreciate you pointing that out, because I tried to put a lot of work into that and be as comprehensive as possible to equip Christians for this issue.
Yeah. So both of us are readily available for anyone out there that might have questions or some issues, need some prayers, some guidance. We'll do the best that we can to help you out to the best of our abilities. You're not in this fight alone. There's other people out there that's standing up in that gap for you guys. And for all of you parents and grandparents out there, we always want to put a prayer over you as well for the things and the battles that you're going to be going through. And Luke's a parent himself. He's got some young ones also. So my kids are grown at this point, but I've got granddaughters that are growing up now. So all of us are being touched by this in one way or another. But we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Hope that you guys got some good information from this podcast, and hopefully you've maybe learned something, and maybe it's kind of giving you a new drive in your battle as we try to battle this thing together. Maybe we've gave you a little bit of encouragement that you're not alone out there trying to fight this thing. And through the grace of God and prayer, I think that we can definitely win this battle, as Satan's going to be defeated. Mm-hmm. When the time comes. He thinks he's got this season and this time, he thinks he's got this battle wrapped up, but that's not the case. In the end, God prevails and Satan's going to be abolished. So we just have to stay here and fight like warriors until that day comes. Mm-hmm. So again, Luke, thank you for joining me this week. I really do appreciate it. You can go to my website, connectingthegap.net, as I said earlier. There you'll find all the podcasting platforms that I'm on, anything that you would like to know about my ministry. We'll be back again next week with a brand new episode of Connecting the Gap. Thank you guys for joining us this week. Until then, don't forget that God's Word never fails us. God's Word has stood the test of time, and through Jesus' death on the cross, He has connected the gap. You've been listening to Connecting the Gap podcast. I'm Daniel Moore, the host for this podcast, and I personally thank you for listening each week. In this world, there are many disconnects that cause chaos in our lives. This podcast is birthed from the desire to share hope and restoration of the power of the gospel by being transparent and open in our biblical walk with God. Each week, we take a few moments as we navigate God's Word and peer into other people's testimonies and encourage each other to connect the gap. We upload a new audio podcast every Thursday and a video version of it on YouTube and Rumble. We are also on the Christian podcasting app Edify. You can subscribe to our podcast on many of the available podcasting platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Deezer, Spotify, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, and many more. We are also available on your Alexa-enabled devices. If you would like to give us feedback or would like to contact our ministry for any reason, including prayer, visit our contact page at www.connectingthegap.net and send us a message. We hope you are blessed by this ministry. This is a production of Connecting the Gap Ministries.